Grace and peace to you from the one who was and is to come. Amen. On his way to Jerusalem, Jesus approaches the pool of Bethesda. It is the Hebrew word for the house of grace. It was said that there were times when an angel would come down to stir the waters. Such troubled waters did not just mirror the burdens and troubles of those seeking healing. The waters were also said to move through the pain and bring healing. Jesus enters the building. The 5 porticos around the pool are filled with sick people waiting and watching for an angel to stir the waters. What the sick hold in common is the belief that the first person to step into the troubled waters would be healed. John tells us that among them was a man who had been paralyzed for 38 years. The thought that only the quickest and most able will be rewarded with healing seems cruel and heartless. And the paralyzed man rightly laments to Jesus, "Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is disturbed. While I'm getting there, someone else steps into the pool before me." Can such a place be called the house of grace? How desperate must one be to wait a whole lifetime, watching others getting into the healing waters while finding no assistance for oneself? Dante Alighieri's description of hell comes to mind. As one enters through the gates of hell, a sign reads, "Those of you who come here, let go of all hope." It is inhumane and cynical to speak of divine intervention as a form of competition, leaving the most destitute and sick in the cold. It was Sigmund Freud who spoke of a flight into illness. This was not meant as a judgment to hold victims responsible for their suffering. It was rather based on his observation that there are times when one feels like a beaten army in the face of an all-powerful enemy. And all one can do is to withdraw into one's own self. One resigns, does no longer expect any change, and finally adjusts one's mind and heart to the idea that life is just about surviving each day. You find yourself among the hopeful and living, but you yourself slowly but surely turn to stone. Such a resignation finally gives up even on feeling any resentment or self-pity. When Jesus enters, we do not hear the man shout for help. It is Jesus who approaches him. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he already had been in that condition for a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" Jesus saw him lying there. One should stop right there and make a pause before reading any further. It has been said that there is something worse than death, which is the unobserved life, the burden of going through life unnoticed and unseen. But Jesus saw him. He has a way of seeing that sees people back to life. And in this case, it begins with a surprising question. Do you want to be healed? Did Jesus notice that this man has given up all hope? Can it be that in order to survive pain and isolation, one completely withdraws into oneself, closing one's heart and shutting oneself off from the world? Do you want to be healed? What Jesus is asking is, can you still imagine a different life for yourself? Are you able to reconnect with your desire and longing to be healed? Do you want to emerge from the troubled waters and breathe again? There seems to be no automatism to healing. We need to want life in order to receive it. Only then can those life-giving forces of healing be mobilized. But for this, you need someone who truly sees you, feels with you, someone who helps you trust life again, someone you can trust enough to ask you, do you want to be healed? It is a question that those journeying through loss and grief might also have to ask themselves at some stage. Do I want to live again? Can I imagine another life after all the pain and loss? Will I have the courage to open my heart again so that I too can be seen back into life? In the second part of her book, Winter of the Heart, Paula Darcy notes that as we find our way through the earliest months of grief, we should not be surprised to be fatigued. Grief has been compared to physical labor from morning until night. Such work of grief might not be visible, but it is real, and the struggle to integrate a new reality is taxing. We are advised to not overbook our social schedule, make time to be still, breathe, and spend time outdoors. It is important to make sure that the pain does not go underground. Designating a little time each day to release emotions is wise. Those who run marathons know they must drink before they are thirsty. If they wait to have a drink until they feel thirsty, they are already dehydrated. We are encouraged to keep a steady diet of things that nourish our inner life. For some it is music, for others poetry or nature or loving relationships. Those breathing spaces of real connection and compassion with ourselves will need to be protected and nurtured. Darcy compares such grief work to an archaeological dig, and it involves the careful study of our life, the uncovering of assumptions and conclusions we used to cling to, and even the questioning of beliefs we had not interrogated before. Instead of just getting through the grief, we begin to discover new truths and learn to accept the temporary nature of life. With time, we may realize that God is always at work in our life, enabling encounters and experiences that call us to open our heart. The paradox of love is great. We grieve because we love, and we heal because of love. According to Stephen Jenkinson, loving and grieving are joined at the hip. It helps to remain curious. We ask too little of life. We live content with what we already see and measure, weary of what lies just beneath the surface of our days. We stand at open gateways into the divine, but we forever hesitate, hold back, satisfied with the view through cracks in the walls. Do I want to be healed? Such desire for healing may express itself as anger. Angry outbursts are part of the healing journey. They need to be recognized as forceful waves of emotion generated by grief that cause us to feel out of control, battered, and afraid. We are encouraged to find places where we can holler at the top of our lungs. Such anger can also be directed to God, evoked by feelings of having been let down. Such loud lament forms a big part of the book of Psalms in our Bible. We are not alone in this, and some of the Psalms can help us name and express the pain. Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest. At the same time, we need to be aware that bitterness and anger function as a kind of protection from the deeper emotions of sadness, fear, and pain. Anger is said to be accessed easier, and it makes us feel less vulnerable. But in the long run, blaming someone for our pain prevents us from touching the depths of our sorrow. And so with time, we will realize that we have to make a choice. We can continue to nourish anger and bitterness, or we allow ourselves to feel the depths of the sadness beneath the anger, which might take us to a place where we are able to ask ourselves, do I want to be healed? Such healing also involves recognizing the important difference between what we believe God to be and who God is. The former is an idea, and the latter is a living presence. Those lying beside the pool of Bethesda were brought up to believe that there is no place for them in the temple. Their illness was said to render them unclean and impure. And even the troubled waters of Bethesda simply mirrored the values and standards of a highly competitive society and promoted a God created in our own image. We are brought up to think of God in a certain way until experiences of pain and loss make us question what we have been taught or even forced to believe. Jesus saw the grieving man at the pool, and the man must have felt a new surge of life, allowing him to articulate and name his despair. He finds the strength to respond and to express what he feels. The encounter in our story is reduced to a few seconds, what for others might take years. His idea of God was about to give way to a living presence, which revealed itself in Jesus. Many images of God we've held since childhood shatter under the weight of grief, and we are let down not by God, but by who we believe God to be. Becoming aware of this is sometimes the turning point of the grief journey. Paula Darcy reminds us that we all have a large investment in a certain image of God. There's a way we want God to be. Sometimes we are indelibly tied to the belief that when God is present, conditions in our life will be favorable. But grief challenges us to change and broaden our understanding of God. It is important to remember that the second commandment given to Moses is about idolatry, the temptation to create God in our own image. Letting go of false images or questioning one's beliefs is distressing, and yet such exploration can be a critical step forward in moving from an idea of God to a living presence. If God is not what I hoped or thought God to be, for example, a benevolent presence who spares the good and the innocent from the blows of life, then who is God? And how can I grow to know God directly? These questions mark an important threshold. Our faith is tested and stretched. To have doubts is just the other side of faith, an invitation to examine and deepen our faith. We find ourselves wrestling with God as Jacob did on the eve of crossing the river Jabbok. Such wrestling is about leaning into doubt without fear, while listening to the questions that arise. It always helps to have these kind of conversations with someone who will not judge us and dares to ask us, do you want to be healed? One of the problems is that our mind is able to grasp details much faster than our heart. Our heart moves at a different pace and requires more time to absorb and integrate new realities. The heart needs the time to break things down into smaller units in order to digest them. Darcy offers a helpful example. A familiar image is that of a bird who flies into a window and is completely shaken by the experience. Rather than flying away, he falls to the ground and sits there, sometimes for hours, giving his system a chance to recover from the impact. The shattered heart needs the same stillness and space. Darcy compares grief to a searchlight that exposes everything that needs additional healing or wasn't adequately resolved. It shines into hidden corners and brings to the surface things that have been buried. Such exposure is not meant to make us feel more miserable. We should always remember that past hurts that are allowed to finally surface do so in order to be fully healed. Whatever is brought to light is calling for our attention. Grief is work. It is physically, emotionally, and spiritually demanding. Repressing grief, on the other hand, is, according to Darcy, like trying to hold beach balls under water. Because the balls are naturally buoyant, it takes substantial energy to keep them submerged, and that effort takes a constant toll. It is only when painful feelings are acknowledged that their power begins to dissipate. And therefore, turning away from pain only causes more pain. But we can determine the pace so that the surge of emotions is not overpowering. It is the nature of grief to confront us with our prior losses, our history of dealing with loss, our unique emotional nature, our faith and personal philosophy, as well as our feelings about life and its fairness or unfairness. But such confrontation presents us with a paradox. The paradox of grief is that this mixture of wounds, sorrow, and misunderstandings can be an opening for significant growth. A greater freedom is able to rise up from the pain. In his A Testament to Devotion, the Quaker teacher Thomas R. Kelly makes an astounding discovery. It is an overwhelming experience to fall into the hands of the living God, to be invaded to the depths of one's being by God's presence, to be without warning wholly uprooted from all earthborn securities and assurances. And one knows now why Pascal wrote in the center of his greatest moment the single word, fire. When love moves, it moves to open us up to an even greater love. Is this what the psalmist meant when she prayed, "Lead me to the rock that is higher than I"? Is this what the paralyzed man tried to say when he lamented about not receiving any help? The mountain in his life was too big to climb. It became a wall separating him from the living. Grief is about finding the love that is able to lift us up to the rock that is higher than ourselves. The same love that has broken us open and caused so much pain may also reveal a greater mystery at the heart of life. Such love enables us to bear what feels unbearable. To allow the pain to move through us is to come closer to the love that seeks to lift our spirit. It is an invitation to rise, but it begins with first raising our eyes and knowing where our help comes from. This is why the famous psalm of a pilgrim, ready to set out on an uncertain journey, begins with a question. I lift up my eyes to the mountain. Where does my help come from? And it is the congregation that responds in this liturgical call and answer with, my help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. To come to a place of acceptance is not about surrendering to the circumstances, but to surrender to the love moving through them. There's a river of sorrow and a river of grace. When the former is allowed to flow, the latter will be able to carry us. To enter the Dead Sea Running beside the river Jordan must be an extraordinary experience. The salt in the sea makes the water much denser and heavier than fresh water. You are able to let go and flow. The Dead Sea is carrying you. I'm not surprised that certain wellness places give you a chance to enter a small dark room with a pool of salty water. We're allowed to experience what it means to be held in the waters of death. Darcy notes that there is a difference between talking about change and actually experiencing change. Psychotherapist David Rickle believes that there are times when we should all be required to sit in front of a fire for 3 days before taking the next step. Partly because grief also tears at our innocence and assumptions. How can we return to the level of trust we once had in life? What are 3 days at the fire compared to the 38 years at the pool of Bethesda, watching the troubled waters come and go? Was the man grieving all that time? Jesus does not even wait for his answer. He sees and knows that he is ready and simply says, "Stand up, take your bed and walk." To walk again is to find your way back to life. Such healing is a profound summons, but it does not mean that there is a lasting feeling of happiness that erases our sorrow. To find your way back to life is to trust the greater love that longs to move in secret rhythm for our heart and mind. As long as both the pain and the love are allowed to move, healing and transformation can continue. Such healing will include sliding back, starting over again many times. But in this process, the awareness of being seen and known by Christ, the loving presence of God, will be able to open our eyes to the knowledge that life is fleeting and fragile, but still beautiful. It awakens us to the extraordinary gift of being alive, even if we cannot hold on to that awareness for more than a moment at first. Healing opens the heart to the presence of an inner light that guides from within. In this process of transformation, God's love will keep reminding us that we have choices about what we will do with our sorrow. It is a daring love, a love that continues to summon us, a love that is not imposing, but inviting, risking itself with a bold question: do you want to be healed? It is a daring love also in the sense that it invites us to imagine a God who sits with us not just at the fire, but also right in the fire, groaning with and even within us. In the famous chapter 8 in the letter to the Romans, the Apostle Paul speaks about nothing being able to separate us from the love of God we found in Christ. The Apostle imagines God's very Spirit breathing and groaning within us. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit Himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And He who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. To hear God's groaning in our own mourning opens a new door. And so as you leave from here, God bless you and keep you. God make her face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Amen.
Lord Jesus Christ, you have come to us, you are one with us, Mary's Son, cleansing our souls from all their sin, pouring your